Okay, so I think that we can launch this discussion. So I'm very pleased to introduce Michel Sirat from CMA CGM. Beata has already been introduced, so I don't need to do so. So what we would like to do in this roundtable is kind of react to the broad picture that has been nicely drawn by Beata. So we have a lot of food for thought. I don't know whether we will have time to address all these issues. So maybe we could start by asking Michel what is the take-home, for him personally, and also for the firm that he somehow represents here. And then I could say a couple of words. Then Beata could reply to all this. And so importantly, we would like to take questions from the floor and, continue the debate with all of you. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of questions that were suggested by Beata's, keynote would then arise. So thank you, Michel, so much for being with us. And so I think that you will have a lot to say. So for those who don't know which firm is CMA CGM, this is really a problem. So I don't expand this, but we can figure out that you are interested in international transport and logistics chains.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today. Obviously, I'm not an academic or economist. I'm in charge of strategy and M&A at CMA CGM. So CMA CGM is the third largest shipping company in the world, the fifth logistic company. Last year, just to give you one illustrative number, we moved 22 million containers around the world. So very large numbers. And I was very interested in what you said, because this is really a peculiar industry, and uncertainty is a key word for this industry. And I would like to give just a few examples of past uncertainties. COVID obviously is a key element, but also explain why we believe that uncertainty is on the rise. And in particular, we expect this uncertainty to have a significant price impact on trade, and I don't know what will be the impact of this price impact on volumes themselves, but it will be one of the key questions we have. So just to get back to past, this industry, you show a graph which was very interesting, about concerns from firms about COVID and supply chain, and we focus very much on the recent period, increased concern about supply chain. What I found also interesting is the fact that for 10 years, previous 10 years, nobody asked any question about the supply chain. It was a given that supply chain were functioning efficiently, smoothly. It was not always the case, but by and large, it was effectively functioning smoothly. And you may say, well, that's normal. It's an industry like any other modern industry. Well, actually not, because one of the key components for this functioning of the supply chain was huge investments by shipping firms, which at the time were all losing money. So we were all invested in ships, huge capital-intensive industry, loss-making. For the last 10 years, for the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, for all companies in the shipping business, the return on capital employed was below the cost of capital. And still this industry was investing heavily. And it's thanks to those investments that supply chain was working. And what happened at COVID, strangely enough, is not that there were not enough ships to move goods around. It was basically that because of economic support plan, especially in the US, a lot of ships arrive at the same time at terminals, creating congestions in terminals. So the issue was in terminals, not so much in shipping capacity. And so you had vessels waiting 3 weeks, 4 weeks in front of Los Angeles terminal, for instance. And that reduced effective supply available by 10 to 15%. And this shift of 10 to 15% created a huge impact on price. Freight rates were multiplied by 4, 5, 6, 8 sometimes. And that was basically the story of what happened at the COVID period. What's interesting is that despite this increase in price, we did not see any reduction in volumes. So the price elasticity, from that standpoint, is not that much for industry, because shipping costs are very small compared to the value of the cost we transport. So this industry is characterized by huge price volatility. Prices were multiplied by 8 at COVID times. They had already been divided by 8. If you compare spot rates Q1 23 to spot rates Q1 22, actually they have been divided by 8. So we are back to normal, so to speak. So how is this going to evolve going forward? Interestingly enough, the shipping industry has again decided collectively to invest heavily in new ships. If you look at the order book of vessels, it represents 30% of existing capacity. 30%. And it's going to be delivered between 24 and 26. So huge investment in shipping capacity. Obviously, totally linked with decarbonation and the need to modernize the fleet, but also with the expectation that globalization is there to stay. So globally, the industry is not believing that we should see a decline in trades, which so far is true. When we look at our volumes, when we look at where we move goods from, volumes are slightly up, between 1 and 3% a year, mostly still from China. The China plus 1, effectively we start seeing this happening. India is a key beneficiary of that, of the plus 1. Not so much Turkey these days, but India definitely. But China is still very much at the core of the supply chain. And obviously one of the key questions is whether it's structural, not based necessarily on a price benefit, or whether it's directly linked with a price benefit for customers. Lastly, mention of price, decarbonation. We believe that decarbonation should, all things being equal, lead to a doubling of the cost of shipping. The question is obviously how we are going to pass through this cost to our customer, and how the customers are going to react to this doubling of cost. If we look at what happened at COVID times, we could say we should not expect a material impact. What is a difficult question for us is, could we consider COVID as the proof that doubling shipping cost is not an issue and doesn't have an impact on volumes, or the COVID situation was too short in time, in duration, to be able to allow us to get to that conclusion? So this industry is based on uncertainty, and I fully agree with what you said. Uncertainty is on the rise. We will probably are going to see shopping times and difficult years for the shipping industry, much more than in the previous years.
Thank you very much. So this nicely introduces the topic. So I would like to react, on 3 points. So the first one is about this reshoring, friendshoring story that you talked about. So I think that there are two elements there that are quite different to consider. So the first one is kind of coordination failure between firms, leading to negative externalities. So each firm has been taking, due to the development of GVCs, etc., decisions that were optimal from the point of view of the firm, but not necessarily from a collective point of view. So if all the firms make the same decision, at some times we will be missing some, essential components or essential medicines, etc. So this is something that we have seen indeed very clearly in the pharmaceutical industry, but not only in the pharmaceutical industry. So this is kind of coordination failure. So for each firm, this is optimal, but for the countries, this is not. And so this is where possibly governments have to intervene in order to fix this problem. And there is a different element to keep in mind, which is the pricing of risk, or how firms address uncertainty. And I think that what we have seen with COVID is not this. What we have seen with COVID is just a repetition of something that has been, taking place already much before, like a decade before. We have had the Fukushima disaster. We have had the floods in Thailand. And so all this has, led firms to start reorganizing the value chain by having more inventories, by having, diversification of their suppliers, etc. So they started to do so. So now this is a big amplification or a big magnification of this that we have, but it started before. So I would like to have your views on this. I think that these are two different explanations. And on this, there is nothing to be done by the government. So the firms will react optimally. And so the type of reaction that you were mentioning, developing inventories, diversifying suppliers, etc., is a normal kind of microeconomic reaction, and so there is nothing to be done by the government. Now, on the consequences for international transport, I think that we will have less just-in-time. So this is the other face of the more inventories. So if you have more inventories, you have less just-in-time. We will have more regional transport. And on this, you did not say much, but I think that this is a big issue, in particular when it comes to thinking of the environmental consequences, the emission consequences of international transport. Because what you may know or may not know, and my take is that in the general public, this is something which is not necessarily well known, is that maritime transport is quite efficient in terms of emissions, while road transport, the trucks, are not. And so if you substitute regional transport to maritime transport, then you will go for transport that is much more emitting. And so this is something that we observed in a study that we did on the consequences and the environmental consequences of the CETA, the agreement between Canada and Europe. So environmentalists were saying, well, this is a big disaster, etc., this agreement. But when you just compute the things, basically, and see that, by signing this, Canada will be closer to Europe, while Germany will be, somehow less close to France in relative terms, because Canada becomes closer. Then you will substitute trade between France and Canada to trade between France and Germany. And so you will substitute maritime transport to, trucks between France and Germany. And at the end of the day, this is something that reduces overall emissions. So this is not something which is absolutely evident for the general public, but I think that we have to take this into account. And I would like to have your views, because I think that one big challenge for, firms that, organize logistic chains, international transport, etc., is to better articulate, regional transport, road transport, and maritime transport. So I think that this is a big consequence to take on board. And last but not least, in terms of consequences, in the transport, my understanding is that we will have less economies of scale. So I don't have a very clear view on this, but if I diversify my, suppliers, it will be more difficult to fill the containers somehow to take this image. And so the logistic chains that have been built on enormous economies of scale with enormous ships, like the one that are, shipped by Siemens, GM, and others. This is something that may be less adapted to the new situation where you diversify your suppliers. So this is for the consequences. And last but not least, and this is my third point, I think that we have to think of the important part of the puzzle, which is the environmental part of the puzzle. So this is the perspective of the green transition. So first point to keep in mind, so emissions from international transport are absent from national inventories. So this is not something that everybody knows, but when we speak of the Paris Agreement, etc., international emissions of international transport are absent. They are not there. They belong to nobody. So at the end of the day, they cannot be there. But this is an issue. And the emissions of maritime transport, for instance, represent 3-4% of European emissions, something like this. You will tell me whether I'm wrong or not, but this is the kind of range that we have to keep in mind. So they are absent from national commitments. They are absent from from the NDCs. So the commitments that countries make in order to abate their emissions. So they are absent. So what can we do with this? So there are two methods that we can apply. One method is to say, okay, so just rely on the corporate social responsibility and think that firms will, improve on that front by adopting new fuels, by retrofitting ships that were using oil in order to use at least GNL, to go for green fuels and this sort of thing. So can we only rely on corporate social responsibility of firms? So this is not evident, because indeed firms would like to do that because they are very much concerned. But if you do that and if your Chinese competitor does not, then you have an issue of cost. And so we have kind of a problem of coordination at the international level. And even in Europe, we have a problem of coordination, because if some operators in Europe do that and if some don't, then we have a problem of cooperation. So we have had, nice declarations. I think of the Banque declaration on reducing emissions of international transport. But so far, I don't know whether we see much, and you will tell us whether this is the case or not. And so the second route in order to decrease emissions of international transport is just what we call as economists command and control, meaning that we just make regulations, or we, this is another possibility, we go for a carbon market for emissions associated with maritime transport. And actually in Europe we did both. The green transition that we have in mind is based on two recent decisions that you may want to comment. One is in January this year. So in January this year, we had a preliminary agreement to include shipping in the EU ETS from 2024, so 2024 is next year, for CO2, and 2026 for methane, something like this, with no free allowances. So this is really something that is, very potentially very important. And in March this year, we had the second decision by the EU Parliament and also by the Council. They reached a deal actually on a cleaner maritime fuels with the objective of reducing the emissions by 2% in 2025. So this is something that is reachable, I guess, but by 80% in 2050, and so this is another story. So do you think that this is really necessary to enter into these, EU decisions? Or is it something that we can leave to the market? So this is my take.
So on supply chains, so you were saying that the process of adjustment started before the war. I'm not sure. So when we looked at survey of German firms in summer of 2021, they were only reporting intentions, but not concrete actions. So I think actually everybody was sort of waiting and see, especially since there was no incentive to invest very much during COVID times, right? And finding new suppliers requires investment. coordination failure, right? Is there a need for governments to do something? I think the Commission, the European Commission, looked at imports from China and concluded that only 4% of product lines are strategic. So, I see the argument when it comes to natural resources that are available from only few suppliers. So rare earth come to mind, but not in general. And actually my understanding is that the discussions in the European Parliament on GVCs are more about making them responsible for all the ESG rules. And, I worry that if we were to make multinationals responsible for the whole supply chain, for enforcement of ESG in the whole supply chain, the first thing that they will do is they will drop small suppliers and suppliers from countries where business environment is difficult, simply because it would be just too costly to enforce the ESG rules. Let me come back to the question of sanctions, because I didn't answer the question before. So sanctions are working, right? But the effect is going to be visible in medium term. That's my take on sanctions. Russia has been sanction-proofing its economy since 2014, prioritizing macro stability over growth. And I think the expectations we had with the particularly early sanction packages, that Russia would fall, would have a financial crisis or a currency crisis, I think they were simply unrealistic. Now, where do we see sanctions working? There is a divergence between price of Urals and Brent, right? So oil exported by Russia versus oil exported primarily by others. And the way we see that Russia is hurting is that they announced recently that they would link taxation of their national firms not to the price of Urals oil, which they export, but to the price of Brent. So that sort of suggests that there is a greater need for revenue, for tax revenue. When you look at various institutions making growth projections for Russia, there is a huge difference. IMF is expecting a slightly positive growth. We are expecting minus 0.15. The European Commission is expecting, I think, around a 1% drop, and Kiev School of Economics minus 6. Right? Where does this differential come from? To a large extent, it comes from assumptions about how well the oil price cap is going to work.
So, Michel, do you want to rebound?
Sure. Just two or three comments on what you said about CO2 and decarbonation. We do need regulation. We are talking about something which will have a huge impact on price, and you cannot expect one individual firm to apply commitments on its own in a very competitive industry where margins are very low and basically the cost of carbon is the difference between being profitable or loss-making. That's my first comment. The second comment is it's all very good to make regulations, but at some point they need to be based on industrial reality. And the difficulty we have in shipping is we all want to decarbonize, we just don't have the technical means to do so. We need fuel, which is green, and it's very difficult to get that fuel. The maritime industry is not necessarily a priority customer to firms, oil firms in particular. And so we have significant difficulties in finding green or methanol or methane, which would be the fuel for the next few years for our vessels if we want to decarbonize very significantly our fleet. We are all working on that. We are all investing in that direction, but it's not that easy. And so regulation is needed, but it's not sufficient by itself. We need some form of industrial policy to effectively create the fuels needed for this industry to be greener. Last comment on competition with trucks. You're absolutely right. It's a huge concern for us, in particular in intra-Europe trades. Currently, we see that our intra-Europe business is basically suffering from the reality of competition between trucks and ships. We apply effectively green regulation already for vessels within Europe. I'm not sure trucks has to do so. And so there is a huge price differential, which is going to have a significant impact. And just last item, sorry. We have EU regulation, but we have also IMO regulation, which is a world-based regulation. And obviously, we need to make sure they are both consistent, which is not always the case.
Thank you. So I think that we can stop here because we could speak for hours and take questions from the floor. So who gonna start? Pamina?
Yes, I have two previous questions for Beata that I will wait. I will after 10 minutes. I will react to what Michel Sirat just said about competition with trucks, and I'm wondering whether, in fact, in reality, the public infrastructure, I mean, roads, trucks, and in particular grain freight, are not also, helping, investments by, complementary to the investments made by shipping companies. Because you need that to access the hinterland. So, and I know you're also investing in.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. In theory, at least, we could imagine an integrated portfolio, so to speak, of freight trains, green trucks, green vessels, green warehouses. We're working in that direction, but that's easy. Freight rate is suffering in Europe too, similar to ships, because of trucks. And clearly, and I know it's politically extremely difficult subject, but the question of green taxation of trucks is going to be an issue in Europe anytime soon, because if we don't do that, there's no way we can effectively avoid the development of trucks, which are not necessarily going to be green spontaneously too. So we need to put in place basically a green tax on trucks so that they move effectively to electric trucks, which is an issue by itself, because here also the industrial reality is not that easy to develop not so much battery for trucks, but charging station for the battery for trucks all over Europe so that they can effectively work. So it's not going to happen just by, in a few days or months, but clearly we need to have the direction.
So, we have Christian, I guess, and then Andres.
Yeah, this is a question again for you, Mr. Sirat. You talked about the supply chain crisis during the COVID situation and about the investments that you're making. So I think a very natural question to ask is, can this happen again? Essentially, if is the maritime shipping industry somewhat like the financial industry, where every couple of years we stare into the abyss of complete collapse, or what is kind of the learning and the maybe risk or adaptation process that you see?
It's an interesting question. The shipping industry was near collapse in 2010 after the financial crisis. And there has been some public support for the shipping industry at the time. Not since. Since then, it has been on its own, so to speak. Very candidly, nobody foresee what happened at the COVID period of time. We were actually extremely worried at the onset of COVID of what would happen on trades, on volumes, etc. And we were the first surprised about what happened effectively during COVID. That's my first comment. The second comment is the difficulty is this industry cannot be looked individually at vessels on one side, terminals on the other side, trucks. What happened at COVID, the real issue which occurred is basically a lack of coordination, to take your example. Vessels were there, terminal capacity was not sufficient, and definitely there was a lack of space in terminals and a lack of trucks to move containers outside of terminals. So the whole industry was effectively suffering, not so much from issue with vessels per se or shipping, but issue inland on terminals and containers. And we don't have any coordination body, so to speak, to make sure that this works efficiently. So from that standpoint, could it happen again? Absolutely. Because there is no way to be sure that it will work naturally. The only thing which may be a counter-argument to that is we all made a lot of money, candidly, during the COVID period, and we all decided to invest heavily in new vessels, in terminals, in capacity. So the supply chain should be more resilient from that standpoint, thanks to those investments. But there's still this issue of coordination, if you will.
Maybe after.
So this is a very nerdy question, but I can't resist asking it. So in quantitative analysis, in thinking about trade, the effects of trade and trade policy, we use data that has a transportation sector that is an input into industries all over the world. But when we're thinking about the trade costs, we generally assume that these trade costs are idle, which means that the trade costs are embedded in the production costs, which is a very strange situation in the literature, and I think it comes from the fact of the way in which the data is put together. The data is put together where transportation is just another input. It's not an input that is specifically associated with trade. It's just an input into industries. And then somehow the goods are delivered to another country, and then we need to impose this extra iceberg cost to make sense of the fact that there's so little trade, and that trade is decaying with distance and so on and so forth. So I just wonder if you know of any effort at the level of the organizations that put together these aggregate data sets, for example, WIOD or the OECD, that would assign the transportation inputs that we have in this data, but that we just see as an input, just like steel or anything else, and would allocate those input uses according to where the goods are going to be delivered, which is what would be needed. I don't know if the data is there for this effort, but I just thought I would ask and see if anybody has any idea.
I thought that the U.S. reports some shipping costs, right? That David Hamill's work comes to mind.
Yeah, for internal trade, there are some shipping costs, but I think only internal trade.
I thought it was for external as well, but I may be wrong.
So, to continue on this discussion, that might appear a bit exotic to Michel, but when you start discussing between modelers, some loopholes just show up. So the problem in the literature is that the data that you immediately can rely on is either the difference between CIF and FOB. And so you may say, well, this has something to do with the transport and insurance costs, but this is also something that has to do with the, errors that are everywhere in the data. So this is not something that we like to use. And so indeed, we have information, as you said, in the input-output tables, world input-output tables or national input-output tables on how transport enters as an input into the production of the various industry, the car industry, the electronic industry, etc. But what we don't know is how to allocate this to the different bilateral flows. So when it comes to say, well, what is the transport cost between Germany and the US via Rotterdam, so we are nowhere. So this is not something that we can do. And at the end of the day, we have to reconcile the model with what the data is telling us. And so we have somehow to calibrate either a preference, associated with any bilateral relationship in the functional form that we adopt, or we end up using what Andres was just saying this is an iceberg cost, meaning that the idea that the product, will be melting on the road, and so you have to produce more than you deliver. This is how economists are thinking of international transport. So you see that this is an area where we can make much progress. So there are other areas where we can make much progress, but on this, that I think that the question is nicely spotted. So we can make much progress. So. Definitively, the US provides some data, which is not the difference between CFOB and which is telling us something about the route of the product and the way it is shipped to the US. I think that Colombia has these too, but these are exceptions. When it comes to Europe, and when you use the trade data of Europe produced by Eurostat, so what you have is just the information whether the transport is maritime or not. So, and this is all what you know. And so any effort in that direction would be great. And so you are perfectly right. This is something that is very difficult for all of us. And so this has a consequence that you didn't mention, but that you have in mind also, is that when it comes to allocating to different countries the international emissions in our model, by the same token, since we don't know what it takes to go from Düsseldorf to New York via Rotterdam, it's very difficult to associate, emissions to this transport. And so this is a problem, because when it comes to assess what the consequences of any decisions, any policy decisions are, we are nowhere, and so we try to use assumptions, but this is not perfect. So any help on that front would be welcome. So yes, in the back.
Yes, I had a question for Mr. Sirat. So on the role of the IMO that you mentioned previously, is there any coordination mechanism among firms to reduce emission, and how is it effective in preventing free riding?
No, there is not, and we could not do it, legally speaking. So we all obviously apply our own commitment, so to speak. We have all, I believe, nearly all made commitments to reduce emissions by 2050, because it's a long time away. The difficulty is what is going to happen between 2023 and 2030 because of the lack of fuels, as I mentioned. And also because we are still, and it's good for us, but we're still a growing business. And it's obviously, it compounds the difficulty of reducing CO2 emissions in nominal terms, because naturally we are going to increase our CO2 emissions in million tons, just thanks to growth in volumes. So part of the strategy behind the targets of CO2 reduction is also a strategy to reduce growth, actually go to decline in volumes. Obviously, we are not comfortable with that, so we are trying to find alternatives, technological alternatives. But clearly, we should all have in mind that in the mindset of some people, what's behind all of this is effectively a decline in trades, in order to get to a decline of CO2 emissions of trades. But there is no coordination, and that's the reason why I said we need regulation, because on my own it's very difficult to ask my customer to pay 30% more for CO2 reduction if my competitor does not do so.
So do we have one more question? Yes?
Yes, Mr. Sirat, are you still a shipping company or a logistics company? Because you talk as if CMA-CGM was still a shipping company, but now you have planes, maybe trains or trucks.
It's work in progress. We started our logistic business back in 2019, so it's only 4 years ago. As I said, we are number 3 in shipping worldwide. We are going to be number 5 in logistics. But in terms of numbers, well, last year was exceptional given the level of freight rates, but our revenues in shipping was 60 billion, our revenue in logistics was 15 billion, so significantly lower. Going forward, our target would be 50-50, to have the same kind of revenues in shipping and logistics, but we're not there yet. But we're working on it. And besides, I should mention, we are investing heavily in new vessels. So we are still very much a shipping company.
So Beata, one word of conclusion, and then we can wrap up.
I'm not sure I have. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to participate in this discussion. And I think, as Andres said, as trade economists, we need to make progress in getting data on transportation.
Thank you very much. So I think it needs a big applause.